I just got the super good news that my 7-year-old car's radiator is leaking coolant fluid everywhere and needs to be replaced for the low price of $1,200. So that's awesome. Great way to progress on a cold Thursday. But what can you do? Okay, so we're back. It's lesson 5. So let's go and get our MongoDB set up. So you can simply go to mongodb.com. And you can, right here, there's a link right in the middle. It says database for modern applications, start free. So we want to sign, this is going to take us to their Atlas cloud service, and we want to sign up. So you can sign up here. You do not need to give them a credit card. So don't worry about that. I'm just going to sign in because I have an account already. They will probably send you a confirmation email to validate. So I won't move forward with the creating the database cluster part until people give me some indication in the chat that you're ready here. So let me know when once you've logged in, you should get to a screen like this one. I'll give you a couple minutes, just be 1 second. Okay, thanks, Barack. Okay, that's good, Maria. We'll come to it, Nick, so just wait here. I'll just wait till everyone's got their account set up. We'll create the cluster together and we'll look at the options. So you won't need to do this again, but I have taken screenshots of this whole process. The screenshots are all in the PowerPoint slide deck that I've put in the lesson 5 folder. So if you're doing this again in future, you have the slides to use as reference. Okay, so Ivan, you had to dismiss some of the other stuff? Okay, that's fine. Just give everybody another minute or two just to complete the process. You're good, So Young, excellent. Okay, thanks, Hung. Okay, that's great, Janelle, excellent. Thanks, Rebecca. Okay, so I think I've heard from not quite everybody, but most people. So we'll move on If you need help or you need me to pause, just let me know. Okay, thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Justin. Okay, you guys should be good. Yeah, if you need me to pause, just let me know. So we are going to build a cluster. So a cluster is basically a database. So we're going to click on build. And we want free because this is educational purposes. So we do not want to pay Mongodb. So just click on the create a cluster on the bottom right where it says starting at free. If you choose one of the other options, you're going to get prompted for a credit card. So they actually use 3 different providers. So they use AWS, they use Google Cloud, and they use Azure. I'm just going to accept the default, which is the AWS, the US East server. So that option should be probably automatically selected for everybody. And it says free forever. So the other thing you can change, so down here under tier, it'll say sandbox. So the sandbox is for, for education, for testing. It's not for production. We don't get a backup for this, which is fine. And the cluster name, so it defaults to cluster 0. So that's going to be the name of your database unless you change it. So I'll change mine. You can leave yours at cluster 0. It doesn't really matter. But it says once you create it, you can't change it. You can only use ASCII characters, numbers, and hyphens. So I'll just call mine GCR Freeman. You might call yours GC and your student number. You can leave it at cluster 0. Really, it's up to you. But again, you're going to be using this database both for our in-class, our project tracker, as well as for assignment 2, which you're going to do later in the semester. Because we only are allowed 1 free database. So call it whatever you want. Just make sure there are no spaces in it. Because if you want to leave it at cluster 0, go ahead, call it cluster 0. And then just click on create. Takes a couple minutes. So it's our sandbox account. I'm using AWS. And I'm going to create a cluster called GCR Freeman. Now, much like on Azure, when we create a database, we also have to create a set of credentials. The cloud service doesn't create user accounts for us. So we're going to need to do the same thing. Once our database cluster is created, we're going to have to go into database access and create a set of credentials, a username and password that we can use to connect to the database, both if we're working from Compass and when we're in our code, our node code. Fortunately, there's no time limit on this database. It's not like Azure's credit system. So if we create the database and leave it running, it'll stay running, I think, until we shut it off or delete it. Actually, I think we can probably just let this run. We may be able to go and create the database user now. So over here on the left under security, we've got database access. Yeah, there's a couple. We'll have to go into database and network access. So let's click on database access. And over here, I have a couple of previous users in the past, We'll want to create a new database user. So click this Add New Database User button. So again, under Security and Database Access, you'll have this button that says Add New Database User. So let's click on that. I'm going to use password as the authentication method. We've got to put in a password. So put in something that you can oh, whoops. So here we're going to enter our username and password. So I will call this and I will generate a secure password. Actually, I'm just going to do a simple password that I can remember easily. I'll just pull up winter 2021. And then I'm going to put these credentials in a file so that I have them. I'll leave this read and write to any database, and I'll just leave these. So basically, I'm just entering a username and password here. A strong password would be a good idea. Because I'm going to be putting mine in and out of my code, I'm just going to keep a simple password. And then just click on Add User. So now I have my new user here. The other security setting we need to modify is the network access. Much like with our Azure cloud databases, by default, they block any remote connections. MongoDB works the same way. So I'm going to go to network access, and I want to add, if you add this IP address, 0.0.0/0, this will allow any IP address in. So if you click on add IP address, you can just enter either your current IP, but that means only where you are now will it work, or you can do 0.0.0/0. That will allow any IP address into the database so long as it has the right username and password. So either add your current IP or you can add all IPs. So this step is necessary in order for us to be able to connect into the database. I've already allowed the school, and then I allowed all IP addresses. So we've created the cluster, we've added a database user, and we've allowed network access to either our current IP address or any IP address, whichever you prefer. When that's done, we should be able to go back to our cluster, and we can see that it's actually running now. We can look at the database. This is one nice thing that Mongo Cloud offers that Azure doesn't. If I click on collections, we can actually see the database here. So it says right now we have 0 databases and 0 collections. So it's empty right now. That's fine. So when you're done, come back to your cluster and come back to this main screen for your cluster. Justin, it really depends. There's no right and wrong answer. It depends on the purpose of the site. So for a small site, it also depends what you're using on the front end of the site. If you're going to use Node, then I would recommend using MongoDB as the database. I wouldn't necessarily recommend MongoDB if you're going to build your front end in PHP or ASP.NET. So once you're back at your cluster, you can click Connect. And it asks us, do we want the Mongo shell? So this is like a command line interface. Do we want to connect our application? First, we want to connect. Let's choose connect using MongoDB Compass, which I asked you to install before the break. So click on this third option, connect using Compass. You can actually download it right from here, but you can say, I have Compass. And if you just copy the connection string here, and it's going to prompt us to replace the username and password in the connection string. So I'll copy that. I'm going to open up Compass. So it wants us to paste in our connection string. So I'm going to paste it in. And then I need to replace the angled brackets and the username and password. So I'll put in my username. And then I'll take out the placeholder for password. So it's using MongoDB with this username and password. Here's my server address. And by default, it gives us a database name called test, which we can change. I'll change that in a minute. And then I'll click connect. So it's connected to our server. I guess our cluster is really our server. We don't really have a database here, but we can create a database. So I'm going to create a new database here. What do I want to call it? I'll maybe just call it COMP2106. It says before it can save your new database, a collection name must also be specified. So it can't create an empty database. We have to put at least one collection in here. So I'm going to call my collection projects. So I'm going to create the database. And now I've got a database here called COMP2106. And I have an empty collection called projects. So Justin, make sure when you put in this line into Compass, you need to take out the angled brackets. So replace bracket username bracket with the username you made, and replace password with the password you made. And also make sure if you're getting connection closed, you need to make sure under network address, your IP address is permitted access. That you may have missed that step. Connection closed would indicate you're not allowed into the database. Okay, I'll go through all the steps again. Make sure under database access that you add a database user, because you're going to need this username and password to connect. So that's the first step. Then you're going to go to network access and add the IP address. And you can either add, for now, if you want, you can just choose add current IP address. So this means as long as your IP address doesn't change, you have access. And then you'll click confirm. So once you have your user, once you've authorized your IP address, you're going to go back to your cluster. You're going to click on connect. You're going to choose connect using Compass. You're going to copy the connection string. Yes, you have to take out the angled brackets. These are just part of the placeholder. It won't work if you put your username and password inside of the angled brackets. You have to take them out. Thank you, Rebecca. So then you're going to click on, you'll have a green button that says create database. So you're going to create a database. You can call the database whatever you want, but you only get one. So I just called mine COMP2106. And then it wants you to create your first collection inside. Just call it projects. And the naming convention typically in MongoDB is to use camel case. So things are in lowercase by and large. So we've connected to our data, we've created a new database, we've connected to it, and we've created one empty collection. So now we can start integrating our Node application in here. So let's open up the project tracker that we've been working on. I'll just launch it in my browser so we can remember where we left off last week. So we had our index HBS. We created an about. And then we had built a project controller with project index. And we used a theme from Bootswatch just to add a little nav bar, little CSS. So the first thing we need to do to get our Node app to start talking to our MongoDB is to install the Mongoose package. So if I go to npm and have a quick look at Mongoose, so 1.2 million downloads weekly. An object modeling tool designed to work in an asynchronous environment, supporting both promises and callbacks. So used for Node and MongoDB to talk to each other. So let's run npm I mongoose. Run it right in the root of your project. And under node modules, we'll now see Mongoose is here. So if we look at the documentation, it says we need to define a connection. If your app only uses one database, use mongoose.connect. So that's what we're going to use. So in our app.js, when our application starts, we want to call mongoose.connect. We're going to use our connection string. This example is using localhost, but we're using MongoDB's cloud service. And I don't think we need all these parameters. And then we'll get into building a model. So I'm going to close up all my files except app.js for now. We're going to put the connection in here for now, but then we're going to move it into a separate file, and we'll look at why in a minute. So down on lines 23 through 25, this is where we have our URL mapping, our routing to the controllers. I'm going to connect to MongoDB using Mongoose here. So we'll require Mongoose. And then it wants a connection string and then a callback with a few parameters. So to get our connection string, we're just going to go back to the MongoDB portal. Yeah, okay, so just create the new database. So I'm going to copy this again, and I'm going to paste it in, and I got to make 3 changes here. Again, I've got to replace the username as well as get rid of the angled brackets. I'm going to replace the password and the angled brackets. And then this parameter at the end here, this is the name of the database. It defaults to a database called test. I want to use my new COMP2106 database instead. So there's my connection string. So we're connecting to the new server on mongodb.net that we created with our new username and password and the new database we created. There are a couple of other parameters we may have to include. I'm going to leave them out for now. Yep, it's the exact same. The only difference is change the database name now, Justin. When we used it in the app, it defaulted to test as the database name at the end. We're going to use our new database name instead. So we're going to try to connect, and we'll do this. .then, so we can chain methods together when we're using Node. So we're going to try to connect, and we're going to try to read a response. So if we get a response, we'll log out connected to MongoDB. If our connection fails, we're going to try to catch an error. Oops. Oh, sorry, I missed the bracket. Weird syntax, I know. It's in the MongoDB control panel. You have to go back to MongoDB. In your cluster section, there's a connect button here. So you just click on that. And you can pick either connect using Compass or connect using your application. And you'll replace the username, password, and database name. So we'll try this out. We'll launch it with NodeMon and see whether this connects or not. There's a few optional parameters I left out of the connection. I'm curious if it's going to work. It may not work without them, so we may need to modify this a little bit. We should get one of these two messages being logged out. Either we're connected to MongoDB or our connection fails. So we'll try NodeMon. We'll give it a shot. Okay. So it works. It says we are connected, but we have some warnings, some deprecated warnings. The current URL string parser is deprecated, and to use the new parser, pass this option, use new URL parser true to Mongoose Connect. And there's two deprecation warnings. And will be removed. So I'm going to just, before I paste it, Maria, I'm going to clean it up so those warnings disappear. So I'm going to set this to use the new URL parser and to use the unified topology. That should get rid of those warnings. It also recommended using in the documentation, it recommended using await. Okay, no, didn't like that. So now I'm going to restart. So those first two warnings went away. So I've put it in the chat, the connection line. Now you're going to have to replace the connection string. Justin, when is that error occurring? So you need to replace the connection string, and we'll add these options to make those warnings go away. So it tries to connect. It then logs this out, and if there's an error, it catches it and displays. So for example, if I put in an invalid password and save and restart, I get connection failed. No, you can't use capital letters. So create your database without capital letters. As soon as I fix my connection and save, NodeMon restarts and it's connected. Now, Justin, keep in mind, never mind, that's fine. But it's got to be lowercase, I guess, because it won't let you use camel case in the database name in MongoDB. I wasn't aware of that, but now we know. So pick a database name with no capital letters. So our app is connected now. But hard coding our connection string into this code isn't a good idea. Much like in ASP.NET, we had our app settings.json where we could store global configuration settings like our database connection. Having it hard coded into the code here isn't a great idea. And later on, when we have other things like API keys, again, we probably don't want to put those right in app.js. We want to break those out into a separate configuration file. So what I want to do is I want to move this connection string into a separate file and read the connection string from that file instead. So I'm going to make a new directory in the project. And I'll call the directory config. And inside my config directory, I'm going to create a new JavaScript file. Yeah, that's what we want to do, Hung, exactly. We want to keep all our configuration variables in one file. We don't want them part of app.js. So I'll create a new JavaScript file. And under config, I'll maybe call this globals. So any global variables, we're going to store in this file instead. The name really isn't important. You can call it something else. This is just kind of my habit. So now we've got a config globals folder. Store any global variables and export so they are public. So we're going to use the exports feature that we used last week in our controllers. We said exports is the node. It's the node terminology for making something public so that it can be viewed by other files in the application. So I'll just create a global variable called db. And then I'm going to cut and paste I'm going to cut the connection string out of app.js. I don't want to hard code it in here. I'm going to store it in here instead. So later on, if we add something like a social sign-in where we have API keys, we'll store those keys in here as well. Because we might also have something like a redirect URI after a third-party login. So we can store that credential in here. So you'll do module.export equals db So any of our variables get stored in this file rather than hard-coded into app.js. So now what we want to do is we want to link to our globals file and then read the database variable from it. So we're going to link to our config/globals. And now for the URI, our connection string for mongoose.connect, we just do config dot, and we'll read our DB variable. So now if we need to change the database connection, maybe we have to reset our password for something, we can just change the globals file. our code in app.js doesn't have to be updated. So this is just a little safer, a little more scalable. So when I save this change, it still says I'm connected. We don't have to use a variable here. We could just hard code the connection right in app.js. It's not really recommended. Those specific configuration values, typically they get moved to a separate file. In ASP.NET, Visual Studio gives us app-settings.json. In Node, we're going to manually create kind of our equivalent file of global variables. So we're connected to the database now. We're not using it yet. We're getting there. Well, step 1 was to create a database. Step 2 was to install Mongoose in our application and connect. Sure. So I created the config folder with the globals.js. So this is just a JSON object where we can add as many keys and values as we want, and we're exporting the entire object. So that way it's public. We can read any of the configuration values from anywhere in the site this way. So any file that needs to read directly from the globals, we can just require it, and then we can read out the individual variable names. And one of the reasons I like WebStorm, so when I hit config dot, right, it reads the DB variable that we put in here. So maybe later this is like a Google or a Microsoft API client ID and secret. So the code editor will recognize this because it's a public variable here. So our application is talking to, so if you run your app with NodeMon, your terminal, you should get a couple warnings. Don't worry about those. But it should tell you that you're connected to MongoDB. Yes. I used NodeMon to launch the application. And I wanted to see whether it showed me that I'm connected or that my connection failed. So when my credentials are correct, it shows connected. If I break the password and hit save, when it restarts, I get connection failed. So we should be getting one or the other message in our terminal. I put my correct password back, resave, NodeMon restarts, and now I'm connected again. So last week when we built this site with the generator, we started to work a little bit with controllers and views, right? We played around a bit, first by modifying the index controller, right? We modified the title. And we modified, actually we didn't modify the index view, this just comes with the generator. But we created a get handler for the path project, /about. And it loaded a new view that we created called about that accepted a title and page text variable from the controller. We then made a new, and this index controller, this comes with the generator. But we also made a projects controller that used Express and Express routing. And we added a path when we got a request at /projects. It was going to load this view that we made under projects and index. So that was what we've got here. So we started to work with the controller and view structure already. Now we want to start to add, in order to interact with MongoDB, we need a model. So rather than, we don't have to create any sort of schema in the database. We've just got this empty database here. We've got a projects collection with no data, no schema. That's fine. So we're going to use a model class to kind of define what does a project look like in our application. But it's flexible, so we can evolve this through time. So the generator gives us views and gives us controllers, although last week it gave us this goofy name of roots, which we renamed to controllers. We need to build our own models directory. Visual Studio will do that. Express doesn't. So in our root folder, I want to create a new directory that I'm going to call, in all lowercase, I'm going to call it models. And inside of the models folder, we want to create a new JavaScript file that, again, all in lowercase, it's going to be called project singular. So just like in .NET, by convention, the controller names are plural, the model names are singular, so there's no S. So create a models directory, and then create a new JavaScript file inside the models directory called project. So we're going to set out our project model, and then we will take a break. First thing we're going to need is we need to make a reference to Mongoose. So we'll require Mongoose. And we're going to define a schema for project. So we're creating a new Mongoose schema. And our schema is just defined in JSON format. So what will a project look like in our site when we're going to, we're using this site to keep track of our school assignments. So what would be the properties of each document? What does a project look like in this application? Okay, so let's have a due date, and we'll use camel case, and we'll set the type as date. Okay, let's have the course. We'll say type is string. We can also make fields required here, much like in .NET. So we can add a required attribute. Whoops, that would just say required is true. And okay, so yeah, the name of the assignment or the title. So assignment. Maybe we'll even put that one first. So type string required true. Oops, and we'll put a comma here. Okay. This is probably good enough for now. And again, this is the beauty of working with a NoSQL database. If we decide later on we want to add more, we want to change the scheme, we want to add things or change them, we can just change the model. We don't have to change the database at all. maybe actually I'll add one other one. Why don't we maybe just add a status so we can have like a to do, doing, done, or to do, in progress, done. So we'll just add a status here of type string. And maybe it's not even required, but it's optional. That's all JavaScript, so it's really easy for us to modify our schema. And then lastly, we just need to export the schema so it's public, visible to the controller. So we'll just export it, use module.exports. We're going to export this to a Mongoose model that we'll call project, singular with a capital P. So this is how we'll reference the model from the controller, very much like in .NET. So we're going to take our project schema that we're creating and defining here. We're exporting it with the public name of project with the capital P. So the model is actually fairly similar to our ASP.NET models, really, except we're using JSON to define things. But we don't need to do anything like a database migration. Because remember, our database, it has no schema right now. Okay, so there's our model. So what we'll do, it's 5 to 2. I'm going to publish this up, take my password out of the globals file. Let's do this for now. I'm going to push this up to GitHub. So if you need to reference anything, the code will be in the GitHub repository. Just remember, you'll have to update your connection string in the globals file to use your own. So I'll just stop. Lesson 5.1 Mongoose plus project model. Does it matter if your site is live when adding this? No, you can use it. Okay, Barak, great question. It maps it automatically. If we have a model called project, it automatically will get mapped to the collection called projects plural. That's the naming convention, much like in ASP.NET. We have a project model, it's going to automatically map to a table in the database called projects plural. So we don't actually have to specify, it's done by the naming convention. So if we have a course model, it's automatically going to map to a table called courses in the database. It's a great question. Okay, so I've uploaded my code. If there's anything you need, you can go to the repository. Again, remember, you will need to use your database credentials in the globals file. Let's take a break here. And when we come back, we'll see if we can actually write the code to add a project to MongoDB.